Okay, Joachim, you asked me about scripts, and that's a very hot topic. It starts, of course, with Byrne. The term Byrne used that and emphasized that at a certain period of time the child develops a concept about the future, and it's the idea of script. Unfortunately, originally, under the influence of other people and his own practice, due to the fact that, of course, it's with people who have pathology that theory has started, the idea of script was associated a little too much, in my opinion, with pathology, with problems. Whereas, from my perspective, if we talk about problems, we need to talk in terms of, for instance, of survival, archaic survival conclusions, which I've talked about before. And certainly clients need help with survival conclusions, which are what causes problems in the here and now, in the adult person, because we either the rackets, which I have talked about before, and racketeering are related to survival conclusions. Rackets can be called a form of survival conclusions. Okay, so scripts are not, I believe that scripts are not to be seen as pathological issues, but rather that we all have a script, and that the script begins certainly at about age 4 or 5 and is affected by whatever messages, positive or negative, we have been receiving so far, and genetic factors also, but that the script is a positive plan that we develop, view we develop about our future. And so, very unfortunately, very sadly, Byrne died too soon. He died in 1970. His book, What You Say After You Say Hello, was published posthumously, and we can find a lot of contradiction in that book. So that I prefer to talk about harmful or pathological issues separately and not associate them necessarily with script. There are treatment issues that may be dealt with by contract, which we will talk about separately. So, unfortunately, as I mentioned, Byrne died too soon, and I really described my views of script in a little article I called, let's not claim it's script when it ain't. And this was published in the TA Journal in April 1977. And I would like people to see it because it includes the idea of stages of racketeering in it and racket functions. And I had a hard time writing this article because Byrne was dead, and I kept thinking about it as though I was arguing with Byrne, and yet there he was. But I was trying very hard to express my views of script. I expressed them a little bit better and more specifically in a chapter that was written as a part of a book published by Graham Barnes, where he called it Schools of TA, and he considered me as being a part of the classical school. I don't think that is quite accurate in present-day thinking. But anyway, in it I have a chapter that's called What Shall I Do Tomorrow? Where I describe script. And I also, in this chapter, which I urge you to read, although it's 1979, in this chapter I start out again with early material and refer to later on refer to the script exercise, which I will talk about separately again, but this is the first time I describe the script exercise. So as time went on, so this is 1979, and as time went on I became more and more convinced about my view of scripts, and more concerned about the fact that in the TA community, script was being talked about nevertheless in a negative way.
Yeah.
And I like to refer people then to my next article that I consider important, published in 1988, October 88, in the TA Journal, which I entitled Withered Scripts. And there again, unfortunately, I find myself arguing and discussing the fact that scripts are not negative and talking about them as I see them and here is the summary I want to read the definition of scripts that I gave in that article, which was my summary of definition. And I said, I wrote it as follows. In summary, I define scripts as follows. Scripts contain genetic elements and patterns related to past experiences, fantasies, and beliefs that are woven together into the fabric of a personal mythological story with many possible variations. Such patterns can lead both to positive and negative outcomes according to the manner in which they intermesh and evolve. So scripts have no specific endings. A script is valuable as an organizing support structure originating in childhood. It enables us to play with various options in fantasy before converting them into actual life. Thus, our scripts contribute to the articulation, actualization, and evolution of our innate potential. I'll repeat innate potential because later on when I talk about drives, I see drives as connecting them to script. Drives are forms of energy or motivators, as I will call them later. And they really operate during script, the creation of script, and during the evolution of scripts as we evolve with them in life. So then I continue in this definition saying the analogy to a theatrical script holds if we think of improvisational theater rather than rigidly defined theater. And improvisational theater is a preset play, but it also unfolds and evolves gradually. So, as I say, here it is through the interweaving of many strands of existential patterns that each individual creates the unique quality of his or her life. Tentative predictions are possible when working with a particular client, but much allowance has to be made for spontaneous changes, which occur as a result of here and now events that happen in a person's life. And then I quote at length, and I'm not going to read it to you, you can go and read it. I quote at length a definition that Salman Rushdie gives about writing a novel. And I consider that our lives are really novels which we develop. So Salman Rushdie, in a 1986 book, writes, "For a long time, I think I don't know what I have to write. Then gradually I begin to think of stories, fragments, incidents, characters, quite disjointedly, and in such a way do I develop then my book." And you can read it further either in Rushdie or in my article, which I quote. So, as a result of this concept of script, I developed what I call my 4-story exercise, which, as I mentioned, I started describing in that 1979 article, and which I continued to do as a workshop in the course of many years. By now, I can say that I have done maybe 2,000 such workshops, and when I do workshops, I specify that they are not therapy workshops. My therapy workshops focused on aspects of the person's life that were dysfunctional and which they needed to change, whereas my script workshops simply help the individual see the kind of perspective he or she developed for his future life. And so the 4-story exercise helps the client see how he or she imagined life from the perspective of stories that affected or influenced him or her in early childhood. I described these workshops in a subsequent article, which appeared in a book edited by Richard Erskine, which you can see in the references in the bibliography. And my particular chapter is called, it takes a lifetime to play out a script. And in this chapter, I give an example of how I work with this four-story exercise, and I invite those of you who see this tape to also develop such four-story exercises. And I suggest that an individual write out four, I'm going to tell you about it, give you the assignment. Write out four, in 10 lines or less, four stories or events, fantasy, not events in your life, fantasy stories that affected you at various stages of your life. One of them that you remember affected you in very early childhood, before age 5. Maybe a fairy tale or a children's story or a different kind of children's story. The second would be during the second phase, about 8 or 9 or 10 years. The third story would be at adolescence. And the fourth story would be within the last 3 years of your life, the more recent years of your life. And in this chapter, I give the example of a woman who allowed me to use her stories. And I'll continue with this. The first example, then you can look at it in more detail in this chapter. The first story that she gives us is that of a Sleeping Beauty, her version of Sleeping Beauty. And the main emphasis, as I say, it has to be in 10 lines or less. The main emphasis is about the young princess who is bored with her life and runs out and then sees an old woman and gets pricked with, in other words, she gets pricked, her finger gets pricked, it bleeds, and then she falls into a deep sleep for 100 years, and she's awakened by a prince who comes from far away. Her second story is based on Malheur de Sophie, and the main focus of that one is that Sophie always has some kind of a creative idea which she tries to play out, but unfortunately it works out badly. For instance, she would like to grow long eyelashes, but she cuts them hoping they grow, and instead they're short, and the end of the story is that she is punished always, every time, by being sent upstairs to bed without her supper. Her other story, in other words, I have another alternative for that story, is the one about the elephant, how the elephant got his trunk, which is again a curious little elephant who wants to find out something about the crocodile and leans forward too much, and the trunk gets pulled, his nose gets pulled, and as a result he develops a trunk. And that's his punishment. He has a long trunk. The story of adolescence is the story of the Lady of Shalott, Tennyson's poem, where the Lady of Shalott is locked in under a curse, and she may not look outside, but one day she sees through a mirror, she sees the wonderful night outside, and she can't resist it. She leans forward to look, and of course all hell breaks loose, the mirror breaks. She nevertheless runs out, and then she dies on the barge, but she has seen the beautiful night, she's gone out. The very last story is the one of the goofy old lady who has lived a rather boring life, but after the funeral of her husband, she nevertheless goes out on the terrace and starts enjoying the sunset and the life outside, and she gives shelter to a young prostitute who was being persecuted. And then the last scene is of her being, after her funeral, but the young woman looks at an album of photos they took, and she sees that she ended her life very happily, traveling around and having a lovely experience of the last part of her life. Well, the person who described these stories, so these stories are described, and then the workshop consists in the listeners trying to find common denominators among these stories. And the common denominators are that in each instance, this young person, as a young person, had a rather creative, dramatic streak to her and wanted adventure, and went ahead with her adventures, but her adventures did not end well. And this is the negative part of her script, that each time she involved herself in adventure, it went wrong. Even the very first adventure, she gets the prince as a result of the long sleep, but she hasn't chosen the prince. And so we don't know how her life is going to evolve. So her life has a lot of question marks. However, by the end, she manages to nevertheless have transformed her life in a rather positive, enjoyable life, which she managed to live out. And the workshop consists in helping the client look at these stories. It always has to be done in a group in order to avoid having the members of the group project onto the client what they see, and help the client see at whatever stage of life she happens to be during the workshop time, what she imagined her life would be, how she wanted to project her life, and possibly interpret and see her life and modify the rest of her life in ways that she wants to modify them. I have had great feedback from these workshops, and people have come back, and we never try to advise or recommend or suggest. We allow the client to look at what her script seemed to be, what her choices seemed to be. We allow the client to think through, to learn a little bit more perhaps about the three motivators, which I will tell you about more later on, and to determine how she wants to perhaps see her life and see her future and construct her future. So you see, these are not therapy workshops, but they are workshops which are aimed at helping people visualize their present-day life and visualize how they want to continue their life and determine the strengths and the positive aspects of their lives. I'll stop here for the time being.
Okay. Fanita, thank you for your description or what you described about your script theory and how you did it. And what I would like to underline are a few aspects. One, I think it's not only you add something to the script theory. I think that's a completely change of the paradigm concerning script was used in the beginning more as something that harm us.
That's right.
And in my opinion and how I understood it and how we use it, I think it's a creative ability from human beings to evolve such kind of thing of script.
That's right.
And that's much more lively, I think, for ourselves, and even how we can use it in business, meaning in working with companies and working with teams and working with managers.
Yes, absolutely, because in fact, when you work with managers, what's going on? You work precisely with people who, on the one hand, are successful, have a good life. They're not, they come to see you not because they are failing and in the gutter.
And suffering and everything. They suffer a bit, but they wouldn't admit that they suffer.
That's right. But they do have, and so actually the script concept is a way of seeing the way people are evolving and how they can evolve, and of course they do come to see you because they want to improve some things. And actually, when you work with them, there are some aspects of their work of their behavior that you even want to reinforce rather than change.
For us, it's more a kind of discovery. We invite them to discover what's in their souls, in their mind, and maybe what would be decision points in their life, looking backwards, and what could be looking forward. So that's more kind. We work with it, and that wouldn't be possible with the old idea of what is script, but it's possible with your idea of
That's right.
And therefore we would like to thank you.
Good, thank you. And also I want to say something else. Now I'm getting excited. I recommend you could very well do a script workshop of this kind. You see, because I emphasize that the script workshop does not require a therapist's attitude. It requires a lay attitude, because actually when I do script workshops even, I depend on the contributions of the members of the group. And the members of the groups are people who themselves later on work with their own scripts. So I do want to say present a few instructions for doing a script workshop. So I think it's tremendously important for script workshops not to be done by one person.
Okay.
By one.
Only by one trainer or coach or whatever facilitator or therapist.
I visualize at least 5 people within the group, 4 or 5 people in the group. I do visualize one person who is the leader, who is also participating, but not participating in that his contributions are more important or better than everybody else's. And the leader's most important function is to protect the person whose script is being discussed, because you want to be sure that no negative messages are being given the person who's presented, because when they do this presentation, and I think you could do that with managers as a sort of a playful Lago workshop going on for a day or two according to the number of people you have.
To be honest, we are doing such kind of
You're doing that. Wonderful. And then,
but a lot of other people can do it as well, and therefore I think the recommendation is very, very important. That it's not limited to a certain therapeutic level, but it's more experimental that you can go for, and we have to be careful about what kind of negative message could be sent.
Very, very careful, because there's a danger of the hot potato being passed on, and I will talk a great deal about the hot potato and the episcript. But that is a big danger, and that's the main function of the leader, to make sure that nothing is, especially somebody who is kind of a type 2 and powerful, and especially if you have a type 1 person presenting his script, who is and remember that the person who's presenting these stories, although it looks as though they're little stories, is in a very vulnerable position. But these are very, they're almost organic, they're almost like, for instance, in the example I gave, the story of the first story, the most elementary story of the Sleeping Beauty. The person who presents it and tells that story, it seems like a very well-known story, is in a very vulnerable position, because he or she is talking about something that's really in the gut there. This feeling, the conflict within that story, for instance, within that story lies the conflict of taking initiative, of being well taken care of. Many of the managers actually correspond to that, of somebody who's got a pretty good background, thinks they had a good background, were perhaps overprotected or overly controlled or whatever, and then try to emancipate themselves. In this story, this little girl tries to, the little princess emancipates herself. It goes wrong, but she really needed to emancipate herself.
Okay, and that emphasizes the necessity of shelter, of protection that has to be delivered from the facilitator of the small group.
Yeah, that's right.
In my experience, the stories itself change a bit. You mentioned fairy tales, and even when I worked, let's say 20 years ago, with my first client with this kind of method, fairy tales with such kind of stuff was coming up a little bit more. Now we have to consider that the culture changes. And it's not even the fairy tale. Maybe it's a story from a comic or from a TV movie or something else.
Harry Potter.
For example, and that means even in that kind of stories, maybe in the same vulnerability you have to care for and you have to look for, and I think that's really necessary if you work with it.
And each person's description is completely different. I did one workshop once where I had everybody summarize Little Red Riding Hood in 10 lines.
Well, different meaning, then.
Every single person's was completely different.
Yeah. And what I would like to add a little bit more, we are even working with companies as a whole with such kind of methodology, not with the 4 stories, but with the idea what could be a kind of, let's say, script, when we work on how to create a kind of vision or mission of a company, and to bring such kind of stuff together. And that means to create maybe a common future, an attractive future for them, and to develop the personality of the company. And there we transferred a little bit, but that really is based on the idea and the paradigm change you invented and brought in our society. Therefore, I would like to add thank you. And another thing, what you mentioned before, was the expression narrative, the script as a narrative. And that you said is a little bit refers to Munari.
No, Tusi used the word narrative in her chapter in the Erskine book.
And that fits
but actually she gave me credit. She said that she developed her concept as a result of mine, but she used the word narrative, and I like to I am taking that word.
So that's impulse and reaction, I think, and that's the way even like script works. We have an idea, we get a reaction from other side, it's coming back, maybe it's there's something that gives us a better idea what it maybe mean, and so forth we can work on. And that is the outcome if you work in a small group.
One other thing I want to mention in terms of these workshops, it's really important to compare the first story with the last story, last three years. Because it is you and see what are the common denominators. You're always going to find common denominators, but you want to see whether the last story has a more creative and a happier ending, or no, I won't say happy, more constructive ending, or has constructive elements than the first story. In this example, for instance, in the first story, she ends up with 100 years sleep. It looks like a happy ending that she's awakened by the prince, but it's not a happy ending because she doesn't choose what goes on. In the last story, it looks like not necessarily a happy ending because it includes the death, but it does show that there is an element of choice, a very strong element of choice, and really an open-ended ending that she started doing all kinds of things that were different. And it's back to my concept of motivators, because I believe that, and I'll get back to that, the pasha motivator is the one that we need to keep having throughout life, and is important right up to the end of life.
And that we will do in the next session.
And that we're going to do in the next session. What we also have to talk about is my concept of episcript, which I developed early on, and which I want to mention here also in conjunction with script, because it's because of episcripts that so many transactional analysts erroneously thought of script, that they identified episcripts and they called it scripts. And there is such a confusion in the therapeutic community of where they find episcripts and don't call them episcripts and call them scripts. So that's an important thing. I will be talking about episcripts separately.
Okay, then thank you.